In the known history of the world, there are gaps, blank pages, lost records. We accept this. But what if one of these gaps wasn't a gap at all? What if it was a redaction? A 1,000-year-long black line drawn deliberately through the human story. What if the greatest cover-up in history wasn't about hiding an event, but about hiding time itself? We have a name for this period, a name that does all the work for us: the Dark Ages. The story we're all told is simple. It begins, roughly, in the year 476 AD, with the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire. What follows, the narrative says, is a millennium of chaos, ignorance, and superstition. A world lit only by fire, where Europe forgets how to build, how to read, and even how to think. A long, muddy winter of the human mind, which only ends when the Renaissance miraculously thaws the continent back to life. But this official story has a fundamental problem. An uncomfortable, intuitive flaw that's hard to ignore once you see it. How does a civilization that produced Aristotle and Archimedes, that built the Colosseum and mastered aqueducts that still function today, simply forget everything? This wasn't just a decline. The story we're told describes a system-wide memory wipe, a continent-sized amnesia that lasts for 30 generations. It doesn't feel like history. It feels like a plot hole. To be fair, any professional historian will tell you that the very term Dark Ages is a crude caricature, an invention of later centuries looking back with arrogance on the past, and they are right. But this fact doesn't solve the mystery, it deepens it. Because if our image of this era is a caricature, then we have to ask a new set of questions. Who was the artist? What was the original picture? And what, exactly, is the caricature meant to hide? This is where our investigation begins, and before we proceed, a small request. If you believe questions like these are worth asking, a like on this video helps our inquiry reach more people, and I'm curious to build a map of our own. In the comments, let me know what city or country you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these ideas travel. Alright, if we are to treat this 1,000-year gap not as a historical inevitability, but as a cold case, a crime scene, then we must start with the basics: motive, means, and opportunity. When the Roman Empire fell, its political structures dissolved, its trade routes collapsed, its libraries burned. In the chaos and the power vacuum that followed, only one institution remained standing. Only one organization had a network that spanned the entire continent, a monopoly on the language of knowledge, Latin, and a vested interest in becoming the sole gatekeeper of the past. If an entire civilization's memory is a library, what happens when that library burns? When Rome fell, its network of schools, public records, and secular libraries crumbled with it. In the chaos, who became the custodians of the past? Who had the buildings, the discipline, and the motivation to pick through the ashes and decide which books would be saved? The answer is simple, and it points to a single institution. In the quiet, cold stone rooms of monasteries scattered across a fractured Europe, a new kind of power was being forged. Not a power of armies, but of memory. These were the scriptoriums, the data centers of the early medieval world. Here, monks, perhaps the only literate class left standing, engaged in the painstaking work of copying manuscripts. On paper, this was a heroic act of preservation. But if you were the only one copying the books, you are also the only one deciding which books get copied. You control the archive. This control was absolute, and it was enforced by two powerful tools. The first was infrastructure. The church had the network, the manpower, and the resources. The second, and far more subtle, was language. The texts of Aristotle, Plato, and Archimedes were written in Greek. The language of the new order was a very specific ecclesiastical Latin. To be copied, a text had to be translated. And translation is the most powerful form of censorship there is. What didn't fit the new worldview could be altered, recontextualized, or simply left behind. Sometimes the act of erasure was brutally physical. Parchment was a precious commodity. To create a new book, a monk would often take an old one, scrape the ink from the page with a knife, and write over the faint ghost of the original text. These are called palimpsests. Imagine a monk scraping away the geometry of Euclid or the poetry of Sappho to make room for a book of psalms. This wasn't just recycling, it was a physical act of writing a new memory over an old one, a perfect metaphor for the era. The past wasn't just forgotten, it was overwritten. And here the story gets uncomfortable. Because this intellectual winter was a strictly local phenomenon. While Europe was supposedly contracting, other parts of the world were flourishing. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom was a vibrant centre of learning, where scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, invented algebra and refined astronomy. In Tang, China, engineers were printing books with movable type and charting the stars with stunning accuracy. According to official reports, in the year 751, the armies of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Tang dynasty met in a massive battle at the Talas River, an event recorded independently in both Arab and Chinese chronicles. The world, it seems, kept turning, history kept happening, just not, apparently, in Europe. This creates a serious problem for the standard narrative. If the decline was a natural consequence of Rome's fall, why was it confined to the West? Why did the light of inquiry continue to burn so brightly everywhere else? It suggests the darkness wasn't a natural weather pattern. It was an artificial blackout. An institution had gained the means, the motive, and the opportunity to become the sole gatekeeper of European thought. But this raises a more difficult question. Was this institution a malevolent guard, burning everything it disliked? Or was it something far more complex? The story of a single dangerous book, a book of pure atheism from ancient Rome, reveals a paradox at the heart of this mystery, a paradox that complicates everything. So, we have our suspect, an institution with the motive, means, and opportunity to rewrite the past. The case seems straightforward, a simple story of suppression. But this is where any real investigation begins to get difficult, because the evidence, when you look at it closely, starts to contradict itself. It starts to tell two stories at once. Let's begin with a number. It's a brutal one. The consensus among classical scholars is that we have lost around 90% of all literature written in Latin. 90%. It's not a fire, it's a continental-scale memory wipe. Of the roughly 770 known classical Latin authors, we have nothing at all from nearly 300 of them. Not a single word. Their names are just entries in a catalogue of ghosts. This is the shipwreck of the classical mind. And for a long time, the story ended there. But then the question becomes, what about the 10% that survived? Where did we find these lifeboats? And here, the simple narrative of a cover-up hits its first, massive paradox. Almost every single surviving text from pagan antiquity, the histories of Tacitus, the speeches of Cicero, the poems of Virgil, survived for one reason and one reason only. They were copied, by hand, by the monks in the very monasteries we've just identified as the firewalls of history. This is not a minor detail. The jailer was also the librarian. The censor was also the archivist. And if you think this was just an act of preserving politically harmless poetry, consider the most extreme case. A book called De Rerum Natura, quote, zero, written by a Roman poet named Lucretius. To be clear, this book is probably the most radically atheistic, materialistic text ever written before the modern era. It argues that the universe is nothing but atoms and void, that the soul is mortal and dies with the body, that the gods, if they exist, have nothing to do with us, that religion is a cruel superstition. In simple terms, it's a 6-volume argument that the entire foundation of the Christian faith is an illusion. According to our simple theory of suppression, this book should have been the first to be thrown into the fire. Instead, we know that at least 2 copies were meticulously produced in monastery scriptoria during the 9th century. Imagine a monk in a cold cell, spending months of his life dipping a quill in ink to perfectly replicate a text that argues his entire life, his faith, his God, are a fiction. Why? Why would an institution dedicated to preserving the word of God also preserve the words that sought to destroy it? This wasn't an accident. Tacitus, whose cynical histories paint the Roman emperors as monsters, survived in a single manuscript copied around the year 1050 at the monastery of Monte Cassino. Without that one copy, made by those monks, he would be gone. The institution that held a monopoly on memory, that had the power to erase whatever it wished, chose to save the very evidence that could be used against it. This isn't the clean, simple crime we thought we were investigating. It's something far stranger. This paradox of the preserver censor isn't a one-off glitch in the system. It's a fundamental pattern. And to see it in action, We can trace the journey of a single mind, a mind so powerful it would be banned, then embraced, and ultimately become the bedrock of the very institution that once feared it. We need to talk about Aristotle. To truly understand this system's logic, we don't need to focus on the books it erased. We need to look at an idea it couldn't erase, an idea so powerful that simply destroying it was not an option. And what the Church did instead tells us everything about the true nature of its power. The story is about the journey of one man's mind. His name was Aristotle. After the fall of Rome, his work, the most comprehensive intellectual system of the ancient world, largely vanished from the Latin-speaking West. His logic was fragmented, his physics and metaphysics almost completely lost. For centuries, Europe was a continent with a phantom limb. It had forgotten the mind that had taught it how to think. But Aristotle wasn't gone. His ideas had simply taken a different path. They travelled east, into a world that was not dark but luminous. In the great libraries of the Islamic Golden Age, in Baghdad's House of Wisdom and the vibrant courts of Cordoba, Arab and Persian scholars didn't just preserve Aristotle, they engaged with him, they translated him, debated him, wrote massive commentaries on his work. Philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes built entire worlds of thought on his foundations. For half a millennium, Aristotle spoke Arabic, and then he came home. The bridge was medieval Spain, a place where cultures met. In cities like Toledo, Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars worked side by side, translating a flood of knowledge from Arabic back into Latin, and with that flood came Aristotle, in his full, world-altering power. By the early 13th century, his complete works were circulating in the new universities of Europe, particularly in Paris, and the institutional mind of the Church had to decide what to do with this pagan thinker who could explain the universe without mentioning God. In the year 1210, the Church made its move. At the University of Paris, the teaching of Aristotle's books on natural philosophy was officially forbidden. It was a clear act of suppression. A line was drawn, but it wasn't a wall, it was a membrane, because the ideas were too powerful to ignore. 20 years later, the ban was softened, and then, in 1255, the policy was reversed completely. The very same books that were once forbidden were now made a mandatory part of the university curriculum. Just 45 years. That's the time it took for Aristotle to go from heretical contraband to required reading. What happened? A theologian named Thomas Aquinas happened. Aquinas performed one of the greatest intellectual feats in history. He didn't reject Aristotle, he synthesized him. He took the pagan philosopher's logic and used it to build a new, seemingly indestructible foundation for Christian doctrine. He quote, _1 Aristotle. This is a far more sophisticated form of power. It's not just the power to burn a book, it's the power to decide what that book means. The Church didn't defeat Aristotle, it absorbed him. It took the most powerful intellectual engine of the ancient world and made it the engine of its own theology. It domesticated the threat by making it a pillar of the system. This reveals a machine designed not just for suppression, but for assimilation. It shows a system that could be rigid, but also pragmatic and ruthlessly adaptive. The control over books was complex, but some argue that the real cover-up wasn't about editing a few thousand manuscripts. It was about editing reality itself. The most radical accusation claims that the conspirators didn't just hide texts, they hid entire centuries. We have seen how an institution can absorb, reinterpret, and canonize an idea it once banned. This is a subtle, sophisticated form of power. It's the power to control the meaning of the past. But what if there is a greater power? A power not just to edit the story, but to edit the timeline itself? What if the most effective way to create a dark age is not to burn the books, but to simply add a few empty centuries to the calendar? This is where our investigation takes a turn, away from the well-documented debates of historians and into a theory so radical it feels like science fiction. It suggests that the greatest cover-up in history wasn't about what happened, but about when it happened. The hypothesis is known as the phantom time hypothesis, developed in the 1990s by a German author named Heribert Illig. The claim is as simple as it is staggering. 297 years of the early Middle Ages, specifically the period from the year 614 to the year 911, never happened. They are, according to the theory, a fabrication, a ghost in the machine of our chronology. According to this model, the entire historical narrative of this period is an invention. The argument begins with an appeal to silence. Proponents ask, where is the evidence for these 3 centuries? They point to an alleged stagnation in architecture, a supposed lack of significant archaeological finds that can be securely dated to this window, and a scarcity of original historical documents compared to the periods before and after. It is presented not just as a gap, but as an unnatural void, an archaeological black hole. Then, the theory points to what it calls historical doubles or echoes. It suggests that the story of the great Emperor Charlemagne, who supposedly ruled around the year 800, is a carefully constructed copy of earlier figures and events. A legendary narrative, it is argued, designed to fill a timeline that was artificially stretched. But why? Why would anyone attempt such an audacious forgery? The motive, the theory claims, was a power play of cosmic significance. In the late 10th century, Holy Roman Emperor Otto III was in power, advised by Pope Sylvester II. They allegedly wanted Otto's reign to coincide with the symbolically potent year 1000 AD, the dawn of a new millennium. To place themselves at this critical juncture of history, they simply invented 3 centuries, pushing the calendar forward to where they needed it to be. It was, in this view, the ultimate act of historical engineering, changing the date on the world to legitimize a new empire. It's a breathtaking idea. It reframes our entire understanding of the past. But a claim this large requires extraordinary evidence, and the proponents of this theory believe they have found it, not in dusty books or ambiguous ruins, but in the precise, unforgiving mathematics of the heavens, a fundamental flaw in our calendar. The claim is so immense it feels more like science fiction than history, but every radical theory needs its one piece of hard, verifiable evidence, a smoking gun. For the phantom time hypothesis, that evidence isn't a lost manuscript or a strange map. It's something much more fundamental. It's a mathematical error supposedly hiding in plain sight within our calendar. To see it, we need to understand that our calendar is a piece of technology, an ancient piece of Roman engineering designed to keep human society in sync with the heavens. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, was a brilliant system for its time. It decreed a year to be 365.25 days long. That 0.25 was handled by adding a leap day every 4 years. Simple, elegant, and wrong. The actual solar year, the time it takes for the Earth to orbit the Sun, is not 365.25 days. It's slightly shorter. The difference is tiny, about 11 minutes. 11 minutes a year sounds like a rounding error. It's the kind of detail you'd ignore. But history is long, and over centuries, those 11 minutes compound. Each year, the calendar drifts a little further from the actual seasons. By the 16th century, this small error had become a very large problem. The vernal equinox, the first day of spring, was arriving 10 days earlier than the calendar said it should. So, in the year 1582, Pope Gregory XIII ordered a fix. It was a 2-part solution. First, a new rule for leap years to prevent future drift. But second, and more dramatically, he had to correct for all the drift that had already accumulated. To get the calendar back in sync with the sun, he decreed that 10 days would simply be erased from existence. In Catholic Europe, people went to sleep on the night of October 4th and woke up the next morning on October 15th. This is all standard, documented history, but this is also where, according to Heribert Illig, the clue is hidden. The Church said it needed to skip 10 days. The phantom time hypothesis simply asks, let's check their math. The calculation is straightforward. The Julian calendar was in use from 45 BC to 1582 AD. That's a total of 1627 years. For 1627 years, the calendar was accumulating an error of about 1 day every 128 years. So we can calculate the total expected drift. 1627 years divided by 128 comes out to 12.7 days. Let's call it 13. And here is the core of the argument. The real accumulated drift should have been 13 days. But Pope Gregory only corrected for 10. A 3-day discrepancy. An error hiding in the most ambitious software patch in human history. Where did those 3 days go? 3 days of accumulated drift corresponds to roughly 384 years of time. But if, as the theory claims, about 297 of those years never actually happened, if they were just phantom entries in the timeline, then the drift for those years never accumulated. The math would suddenly work. A 13-day problem becomes a 10-day problem. On the surface, it feels like a perfect, elegant proof. A 3-day gap in the world's timeline, found not in a dusty archive, but in simple arithmetic. It's a clean, numerical anomaly that seems to demand an extraordinary explanation. But in any serious investigation, the most elegant clues are the ones that demand the closest inspection. And this one contains a single, fatal error. And so, we stand before a beautiful, elegant piece of evidence. A 3-day gap in the fabric of time revealed by simple mathematics. It's a compelling argument. Almost too compelling. In any investigation, when a clue seems to perfectly explain everything, that's precisely when you should re-examine it. Not the calculation itself, but its premise. The whole theory rests on one critical assumption, that Pope Gregory's reform in 1582 was trying to reset the calendar all the way back to its origin, to the year 45 BC, when Julius Caesar first designed it. But was it? What was the reform's actual mission? We don't have to guess. Pope Gregory XIII left a detailed instruction manual. It's a papal bull, the official decree that launched the new calendar, and its name is Inter Gravissimus. And in this document, the Pope is crystal clear about his objective. He wasn't trying to align the calendar with the Rome of Caesar. He was trying to align it with a much more important date for the Church, the year 325 AD. This was the year of the First Council of Nicaea. It was a foundational moment for Christianity, and it's where the Church officially fixed the date of the spring equinox to March 21st to standardize the celebration of Easter. By 1582, the equinox had drifted 10 days away from this anchor. The Pope's mission was not to fix 16 centuries of error. It was to erase the drift that had occurred since the Council of Nicaea. Let's do the math again, this time with the correct starting point. From the year 325 to the year 1582, there are 1,257 years. We take that number and multiply it by the 11-minute error per year. The result is just under 10 days. There is no 3-day discrepancy. There is no missing time. The math, when anchored to the correct historical event, works perfectly. The 10 days of drift that Pope Gregory needed to remove are exactly the 10 days that the calculation predicts. The entire calendar proof, the smoking gun of the phantom time hypothesis, dissolves. It was built on a single, fatal misreading of a primary source, so the calendar doesn't lie. But it also doesn't point to a conspiracy. It points to a simple correction. But an objection immediately arises. What if the document itself, the record of the Council of Nicaea, is part of the forgery? What if all human records from that period were fabricated? To be certain, we would need a witness that cannot be edited, a witness that has no ideology, that cannot be coerced into lying. We would need a clock that was keeping time long before humans began writing history. A clock made of wood. A mathematical error is a clean, logical refutation. But it remains one human argument pitted against another. A conspiracy of this magnitude, a lie that swallows centuries, would have to erase more than just numbers on a page. It would have to alter physical reality itself. So to truly test this, our investigation needs a different kind of witness, one that cannot be bribed, silenced, or forced to rewrite its records. A witness that has been keeping its own impeccable chronicle year by year, for millennia, indifferent to popes and emperors alike. We need to look at the trees. The science is called dendrochronology, and its core principle is beautifully simple. Every year, a tree grows a new ring. In a good year, with plenty of sun and rain, the ring is wide. In a year of drought or hardship, the ring is narrow. This unique sequence of wide and narrow rings creates a distinct pattern, a kind of natural barcode that is specific to a particular time in a particular region. Scientists can take a sample from an ancient living tree and read its barcode of the last few centuries. Then they can find timber from an old building, perhaps a medieval cathedral. They match the pattern in the outer rings of that timber to the pattern in the inner rings of the living tree. Once they find a perfect overlap, they have extended the timeline further back. They can repeat this process again and again, matching the cathedral beam to a Roman bridge piling, the Roman piling to a prehistoric log preserved in a bog. Link by link, they forge a continuous chain, a physical ladder reaching deep into the past. A team at the University of Hohenheim in Germany dedicated decades to exactly this monumental task. By meticulously matching oak and pine samples from all across Central Europe, they constructed one of the longest and most complete chronologies on Earth, an unbroken, year-by-year record stretching back 12,460 years. This is a calendar written by nature itself. It is not based on any human document, any religious text, or any emperor's decree. It is a direct physical recording of time, and so we can ask it a very simple question. Is there a 300-year gap somewhere between the 7th and 10th centuries? The answer from the wood is unequivocal. No, the rings for the years 614, 751, and 911 are all there. The entire period that was supposedly fabricated is present, recorded in an unbroken sequence of annual growth. The trees of Europe, it seems, were not in on the conspiracy. This is a powerful physical check. The local evidence seems definitive, but for a theory this grand, a local check is not enough. For the phantom time hypothesis to work, the conspiracy could not have been merely European. It would have to have been global. Because if you secretly insert 300 years into one continent's calendar, you create a massive, catastrophic desynchronization with every other civilization on the planet. Their histories would no longer align with yours. So the next test is obvious. We need to find a place and a moment where two great independent civilizations met. An event recorded by both sides, right in the heart of a supposed phantom year. A single, fatal error in arithmetic is one thing. The silent 1,000-year testimony of trees is another. But a conspiracy to erase 3 centuries would have to be global. It couldn't just fool Europe. It would have to fool the entire planet. So, to run our final check, we need to leave the forests of Germany and ask a simple question. What was the rest of the world doing during these supposed phantom years? The original theory actually points us in the right direction. It correctly notes that while Europe was in a period of transformation, other civilizations were at their zenith. The Islamic Golden Age was igniting, and in the East, China's Tang dynasty was a beacon of culture and power. Proponents of the phantom time idea use this as evidence that Europe's decline was somehow artificial, but in doing so, they overlook a critical detail. Flourishing civilizations don't just write poetry and build magnificent cities, they keep records. Meticulous, date-stamped and often cross-referenced records. Let's pick a year, deep in the heart of the alleged phantom period, the year 751. According to the theory, this year is a ghost. It never happened. Yet on the banks of the Talas River, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, two of the world's great superpowers met for a battle that would shape the future of Asia. From the west, the armies of the expanding Abbasid Caliphate. From the east, the imperial forces of Tang China. For an investigator, this event is a perfect anchor. Why? Because it was documented by two completely independent witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their stories. In the imperial capital of Chang'an, Chinese court historians recorded the battle, the commanders, and the outcome in chronicles like the Tongdian. Hundreds of miles away, in a different language and using a different calendar, Arab historians like Ibn al-Athir did the same. And when we place these two independent accounts side by side, they tell the same story. They describe the same battle, in the same location, in the same year. They even align on a world-changing consequence. It was after the Battle of Talas that the technology of papermaking, a closely guarded Chinese secret, was transferred to the Islamic world through prisoners of war. A phantom year had remarkably solid consequences. To believe the theory now, the scale of the conspiracy must expand to an impossible degree. It would mean that a handful of European monks not only falsified their own history, but also somehow reached across continents to persuade the emperor's court in China and the caliph's court in Baghdad to invent a fake battle, and then independently insert it into their own histories at the exact same non-existent point in time. It's not a cover-up anymore. It's a godlike manipulation of global reality. And it wasn't just this one battle. Chinese astronomers, with no connection to the European timeline, dutifully recorded every passage of Halley's Comet, including its appearance in the year 760. In the late 800s, the Arab astronomer al-Battani was making observations in Syria so accurate that Copernicus would rely on them 7 centuries later. The physical clocks of the trees, the celestial clock of the stars, and the interlocking clocks of human civilizations all agree. The years were real. The only phantom here was the theory itself. So the most spectacular claim, the assertion of a grand temporal conspiracy, dissolves under the weight of global evidence. But this doesn't mean there are no genuine mysteries left in the historical record. The very human desire to believe in a simple, all-encompassing cover-up often comes from a real place. It comes from encountering artifacts that genuinely seem to defy easy explanation. And one of the most famous is a map. The attempt to rewrite the calendar is a grand, abstract idea. It's a theory about the very structure of reality, fought with numbers and documents. But sometimes, the most powerful challenge to official history isn't a theory. It's an object. A physical thing you can look at, something that seems to whisper from an impossible past. After chasing phantom centuries, our investigation now turns from the abstract to the tangible, to a single piece of gazelle skin discovered in 1929 deep inside the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. It's a fragment of a world map, compiled in the year 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis. As a map, it's a masterpiece of its time. It shows the coasts of Europe, North Africa and Brazil, with a level of accuracy that is remarkable. Piri Reis himself noted on the map that he compiled it from about 20 different source charts, including some captured from a Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus. It is, without question, a priceless historical document. But that's not why it's famous. The fame comes from what's drawn at the very bottom, a coastline that continues eastward from the southern tip of South America, curving into a landmass that shouldn't be there. For decades, this was just seen as a cartographer's best guess about a rumoured southern continent. But in the 1960s, a history professor named Charles Hapgood looked at this coastline and proposed a truly world-altering theory. He claimed that this was not a guess, it was a precise depiction of the coast of Antarctica, but not the Antarctica we know today, buried under miles of ice. According to Hapgood, the Piri Reis map shows the coastline of Antarctica before it was covered in ice. Let's just pause and absorb what that implies. The Antarctic ice sheet began to form over 30 million years ago and reached its current state at least 15 million years ago. To have mapped that coastline without ice, a civilization would have needed global navigation and advanced cartographic skills during a geological era, long before Homo sapiens even existed. It suggests that Piri Reis had access to source maps from a forgotten, prehistoric super-civilization. This is no longer a story about monks editing books or emperors fiddling with the calendar. This is a claim that all of human history is just the final chapter of a much longer and much more advanced story. The map becomes an __quote_4__, physical proof that our timeline is wrong, that a technologically superior culture was wiped from the earth, leaving behind only faint echoes, like this one impossible chart. It is an irresistible mystery, a map from the 16th century, showing a continent that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 300 years, and showing it in a state it hasn't been in for millions. But in any good investigation, the answer isn't found in what we project onto the evidence. It's found in what the evidence itself tells us, and Piri Reis wrote his own notes right there on the map itself. The map is a beautiful and unsettling object. At first glance, the case for a lost ancient knowledge seems closed. That southern landmass, branching off the coast of South America and stretching east, it looks unmistakably like the northern coast of Antarctica, free of ice, a coastline that no human has seen for millions of years. For decades, this image has been the cornerstone for an entire world of speculation. It suggests a forgotten civilization, a lost science, a map passed down through millennia. But any good investigation must look at all the evidence, not just the lines, but the words. And Piri Reis, the Ottoman admiral who compiled this map in 1513, left us his notes, written directly onto the parchment. And this is where the simple story begins to fall apart. Right there, on that southern landmass, the cartographer describes the climate. He notes, and I'm paraphrasing from the academic translations, that this region is exceedingly hot. He also mentions the presence of large snakes. So, we have a contradiction. A direct conflict between what we think we see and what the map's creator explicitly tells us. An ice-free Antarctica would be cold, not hot, and it certainly wouldn't be home to giant serpents. This isn't a crack in the theory. It's a chasm. The academic consensus, led by cartographic historians like Gregory Mackintosh, points to a much simpler, more practical explanation. The Piri Reis map is a composite stitched together from multiple source maps of varying quality. And it was drawn on a piece of gazelle skin, an irregular and finite surface. The evidence suggests that the southern landmass is not Antarctica at all. It is the coast of South America, which the cartographer simply bent 90 degrees to the east to make it fit on the parchment. It's a practical compromise, a common problem for mapmakers of the era trying to reconcile new information with the physical limits of their materials. And then there's the final geological check. The Antarctic ice sheet isn't a recent phenomenon. According to core samples and geological studies, it has been in place for at least 14 million years. There was no ice-free period for any ancient civilization to map. The land beneath that ice has been a mystery until the age of radar and satellites. So if the map isn't a message from a lost civilization, what is it? The truth is in many ways more impressive. This map is a masterpiece of 16th century intelligence gathering. Piri Reis himself tells us he used about 20 different source maps. Some were ancient, some were from his contemporaries, and one, he notes, was a map captured from a Spanish sailor who had sailed with Christopher Columbus on his voyages. This document is not a relic of a forgotten past. It is a cutting-edge, top-secret intelligence report from the very dawn of the Age of Discovery, showing what the world's great powers knew, and didn't know, about a rapidly expanding planet. The wonder of the Piri Reis Map is not that it preserves a perfect image of the ancient past, but that it captures an imperfect, messy, and thrilling moment of the human present. It shows knowledge being assembled, not revealed. The real mysteries, it seems, are not about phantom years or impossible coastlines. They are about human institutions, human power, and human memory. And the heart of that mystery lies in a place that is both very real and entirely legendary. A place with 85 kilometers of shelves, holding the secrets of 1,000 years, the Vatican archives. If a single map can contain such a deep and unsettling mystery, then where do all the other anomalies lead? Where do you store a suppressed timeline, a forgotten science, or the true history of the world? If there was a cover-up on the scale we are contemplating, it would require a vault, a central repository, guarded for centuries, with the institutional power to outlive any single human, any government, any empire. Our investigation, having chased phantom centuries and cryptic coastlines, now arrives at a single point on the map. A city within a city, the Vatican, but not the Vatican of sunlight and open squares. We are looking for its opposite, a place beneath the ground, protected by tradition, secrecy, and the world's oldest active military, the Swiss Guard. Down past the public chapels and manuscript rooms lies the heart of the institution's memory. It's not a room, or even a building. It is a subterranean nation of paper. According to the Vatican itself, it contains 85 kilometers of shelving. Let's pause on that number. 85 kilometers. That's the distance from central London to Cambridge. A continuous line of documents, stretching back over 12 centuries. It contains the private correspondence of popes, the records of trials, the diplomatic cables that shaped kingdoms, and the petitions of ordinary people. And for centuries, it has been known by a name that seems to confirm every conspiracy theory ever whispered about it. The Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, the Vatican's secret archives. The name itself feels like an admission. And for those who believe in a grand historical cover-up, this is the crime scene. This is ground zero. This, the theory claims, is not just a collection of church documents. It is a library of stolen knowledge. The place where the pages torn from our history books are kept. It is here, proponents of the theory say, that one would find the lost Gospels, the blueprints for forgotten technologies, perhaps even working models of anti-gravity. It is, in this narrative, the hard drive of humanity, and for 1,000 years almost no one has had the password. 85 kilometers of secrets, a library of suppressed history, locked away. The very name seems to be a confession. Written in plain Latin, the secret archive. It confirms our darkest suspicions. But what if the greatest secret of this place is that its name doesn't mean what we think it means? The whole story seems to pivot on a single, powerful word, a word that conjures images of hidden vaults, forbidden knowledge, and a truth so dangerous it must be locked away from the world. In its full Latin title, Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, the word is secretum, the Vatican secret archives. Is a perfect name for a conspiracy. But this is where our investigation must become very precise, because words, like history, can have their meanings rewritten over time. The modern English word secret implies concealment, something intentionally hidden. But the Latin word secretum has a different origin. It comes from the verb secernere, which means to separate, to set apart. It didn't mean a hidden archive, it meant a private archive. The personal administrative papers of the Pope, separate from the general archives of the various Vatican departments. It was a bureaucratic term, not a conspiratorial one. If you think this is just a subtle linguistic defense, you are not alone. Over the centuries, the popular meaning has almost completely erased the original one. The misunderstanding became so profound that in October of 2019, Pope Francis himself issued an official decree, a motu proprio. He formally changed the name from the Vatican Secret Archive to the Vatican Apostolic Archive, and in his own words, he explained why. He wrote that the change was needed because the word secretum, detached from its Latin context, had acquired nuanced, even negative shades of meaning, suggesting that the Vatican was hiding things. The name itself, he argued, was creating the very myth it was accused of representing. So, the name is a misunderstanding. But what about the access? Is it truly a fortress, impenetrable to outsiders? The reality is, more like a high-level university library. Access for qualified researchers was first granted in 1881 by Pope Leo XIII. Today the rules are strict, but they are academic, not occult. You need a graduate-level degree, a letter of recommendation from a professor or a research institute, and a clear research topic. The application is free. Once approved, you join the roughly 60 scholars who pass through its gates every working day. You enter a quiet courtyard, leave your belongings in a locker, no pens, only pencils are allowed inside, and enter a reading room. There is no browsing. You request specific documents from the indexes, and they are brought to your desk. It's a slow, methodical, professional process. The very opposite of a Hollywood heist. The fortress of secrets turns out to be a functioning, if highly regulated, academic institution. This, of course, doesn't mean everything is open. Like any government archive, there are rules, and some collections remain closed, usually for a period of 75 years. But the image of a vault where all of history is locked away from human eyes, that image is false. Scholars have been working inside day after day for over 140 years, which brings us to a much more interesting question. If the archive isn't a secret bunker but a private library open to professionals, what have they found? Have they discovered blueprints for impossible machines? Or is the truth buried in those 85 kilometers of shelves even stranger? So if the archives are not a fortress but a library with strict entry rules, what do scholars actually find inside? Do they uncover blueprints for forgotten technologies, filed away next to papal decrees? Do they see evidence of contact with otherworldly beings? The truth is, no one has ever found an alien skull or a map to Atlantis. But what they have found is, in many ways, far more revealing. The secrets in the archive are not about suppressed physics, but about suppressed politics, not forgotten science, but the forgotten mechanics of power. Take a case from 2001. A paleographer named Barbara Frail was working deep within the archives. She wasn't looking for a conspiracy. She was doing the patient, painstaking work of a historian, and she found a document that had been lost, not intentionally hidden, but misfiled for 700 years, absorbed by the immense quiet gravity of the institution's bureaucracy. It was the Chinon parchment, a record of a papal hearing from 1308. It detailed the interrogation of the leaders of the Knights Templar. For centuries, the official story was that the Templars were condemned by the Church as heretics. But this document, this forgotten piece of paper, told a different story. It showed that Pope Clement V, in private, had actually absolved the Templar leaders of heresy. He found them innocent of the most damning charges. This changes everything. It suggests the destruction of the Templars was not an act of faith, but a cold political calculation, carried out to appease a powerful and indebted French king. The secret wasn't a death ray. It was a moral compromise. A quiet decision made under political pressure that sealed the fate of thousands and reshaped the balance of power in Europe. And that is the true nature of what the archive holds. It's filled with discoveries like this. The shelves contain the desperate plea from 81 English lords and clergy to the Pope, demanding he annul King Henry VIII's marriage. You can see the original records from the trial of Galileo, letters from Abraham Lincoln. A note from Michelangelo complaining that he hadn't been paid on time for his work on the Sistine Chapel. These are not the secrets of gods or aliens, they are the secrets of men. The archive is not a vault of forbidden science, it is a sprawling, meticulously kept, and sometimes chaotic record of an institution wrestling with power, with faith, and with its own history for 2,000 years. The secrets it holds are about human fallibility, and that, perhaps, is a more profound and unsettling kind of truth than any fantasy. The archive, then, is a testament to the power of an institution to manage its own memory. But it also shows that this institution was not all-powerful. Sometimes, the archive itself becomes a victim, and the greatest single loss of knowledge from the Vatican's collection didn't come from a secretive pope, but from an emperor. The idea of the archive as an institution that has outlasted empires can make it seem invulnerable, a fortress of memory, standing outside of time. But this is an illusion. The archive is a physical place, subject to the same forces of history as everything else. And in the early 19th century, it faced its greatest ever threat, not from a rival theology, but from a thoroughly modern idea. In 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte was the master of Europe, and he had a vision. He believed that all of history's most important records should be gathered in one grand central archive. His capital, Paris, would become the memory of the world. And so, he ordered the confiscation of the Vatican's entire collection. 3,239 crates of documents were loaded onto wagons and hauled over the Alps to France. It was an act of supreme organizational ambition. But what power builds, power can also break. After Napoleon's fall, the process of returning the archive to Rome began. It was a disaster. The transport was poorly funded, carts broke down, crates were abandoned on the roadside. In Paris, officials needing to clear space simply burned hundreds of documents they deemed useless. Thousands more were sold by weight to a local merchant who used the priceless medieval parchments as wrapping paper for his customers. Think about that for a moment. A papal bull from the 12th century wrapping a piece of cheese, the confidential report of a papal nuncio used to line a fish basket. This wasn't a deliberate act of suppression. It was something almost worse, an act of bureaucratic indifference. When the dust settled, an estimated 1/3 of the collection never made it back to Rome. 1/3 of the West's institutional memory lost forever. Not hidden in a vault, not suppressed by shadowy cardinals, but erased by rain, neglect, and the mundane realities of a failed logistical operation. The irony is staggering. The single greatest loss of knowledge from the Vatican archives was inflicted not by the Church itself, but by a secular emperor trying to create a more organized world. This story forces us to adjust our investigation. The image of a single, all-powerful institution perfectly controlling history for centuries begins to fray. The archive is not just a fortress, it has also been a victim. Knowledge, it turns out, is fragile, and the forces that destroy it are often chaotic and unpredictable. But the case against the Church isn't just about lost paper, it's about lost lives. It's about a war on ideas waged not with redaction, but with fire. This brings us to the smoke rising over the Campo de Fiori in Rome, and the ultimate symbol of this conflict, the Inquisition. If the war for the past is fought with documents, ink, and silence, there comes a point where those tools are no longer enough. When an idea is too dangerous to be merely locked away or written out of history, the system needs another instrument, a more final one. Our investigation now moves from the quiet corridors of the archive to the open public square, to the war not just on ideas, but on the people who hold them. And there is no greater symbol of this war than a single haunting image. The year is 1600. The place is the Campo de Fiori, the _____9_ in the heart of Rome. A man stands chained to a stake, surrounded by wood. He has been imprisoned for 8 years, interrogated, and has refused to renounce his vision of the world. His name is Giordano Bruno, and as the flames rise he becomes immortal, not a saint but a martyr. The ultimate martyr for science. The story, as it has been passed down for centuries, is brutally simple. It's the story of a man who looked at the stars and saw not the small contained cosmos of the Church, but an infinite universe, a universe teeming with countless worlds, perhaps with countless other forms of life. He was a philosopher, a visionary, a man who dared to suggest that God's creation was immeasurably vaster and more magnificent than the official doctrine allowed. In this telling, Bruno is not just a victim. He is a hero, a man of reason standing alone against an empire of dogma. He embodies the conflict that defines the modern age, the struggle of free inquiry against the suffocating power of an institution that claims a monopoly on truth. He saw too much, too early. He spoke too freely. And for that, the Inquisition silenced him with fire. It is the perfect crystalline example of everything our investigation has been pointing towards. An institution so terrified of a new idea that it would rather kill the thinker than engage with the thought. Bruno's death seems to be the final, irrefutable proof. It's the smoking gun, not hidden in an archive, but displayed for all the world to see. It's a story that needs no complex interpretation. It feels true because it confirms a simple, powerful narrative. A war was waged on knowledge, and Giordano Bruno was its most famous casualty. And if the story were this clean, this straightforward, our investigation might well end here. But the trial records, or what little of them survived Napoleon's raid on the archives, tell a different, and in some ways, a much stranger story. Because when you look at the specific charges that were brought against him, the things the Church considered truly dangerous, you find that astronomy was not at the top of the list. In fact, it was hardly on the list at all. The story is brutal, and it's simple. In the year 1600, the Catholic Church burned a man alive for his ideas. For this, Giordano Bruno became a martyr, not just for free thought, but specifically a martyr for science. The man who died, we are told, for claiming the Earth was not the centre of the universe, and for daring to suggest that other stars might have their own worlds, their own planets. This is the version of the story that serves our narrative of a grand suppression. And if this is true, the case is closed. But in an investigation, a story that is too simple, too perfect, is often a sign that we're not looking at the evidence. We're looking at a monument. So let's look at the actual indictment. Let's examine the charges brought against him by the Roman Inquisition, the reasons for which he was actually condemned to the stake. When we do, something strange happens. The charge of heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun, is barely mentioned. It was on the list, but it wasn't the reason he was executed. The core of the case against him was a list of direct theological attacks on the very foundation of Christianity. Bruno was accused of denying the Trinity. He was accused of denying the divinity of Jesus Christ. He denied that Mary was a virgin, and perhaps most critically, he denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, the central Catholic belief that the bread and wine of communion literally become the body and blood of Christ. These are not scientific propositions. They are fundamental heresies. And what about his famous belief in infinite worlds? This is where the story gets even more complex. As the historian Frances Yates demonstrated in her groundbreaking work, Bruno was not a scientist in the way we understand the term today. He was a practitioner of Renaissance magic. He was a student of Hermeticism, an esoteric tradition that saw the universe as a living divine organism filled with magical forces. For Bruno, Copernicus's sun-centered model was not just a better mathematical tool. It was a powerful mystical diagram. It was a restoration of the ancient magical Egyptian sun worship. His infinite worlds were not a prediction based on astronomical data. They were a necessary part of his magical religious system, a universe teeming with divinity that could not be confined to one solar system. In short, the Inquisition didn't see a proto-Galileo. They saw a rival priest preaching a new, pantheistic, magical religion that aimed to dismantle Christianity from its very core. He wasn't just proposing a new astronomy, he was proposing a new God. He was trying to undo the past 1500 years of theology, and for that, the institution of that theology destroyed him. The tragedy of Giordano Bruno is not that the Church killed a scientist. The tragedy is that we have flattened him into one. By turning him into a simple martyr for science, we ignore the stranger, darker and more radical truth of who he was. A defiant mystic who waged a theological war against the most powerful institution on earth and lost. So the story of Bruno is not a simple tale of science versus faith. It's a story of one faith versus another. But if Bruno is a complicated case, what about the one that seems indisputable? The scientist who was famously shown the instruments of torture, who was forced to recant and who, according to legend, muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves." the Case of Galileo Galilei. If the Case of Bruno is a messy tragedy of magic and theology, then the story of Galileo Galilei seems at first to be brutally simple. Here, surely, is the clean, undeniable case. The brilliant astronomer, armed with his telescope and the truth, crushed by the blind dogma of the Inquisition. This is the story we all know. It's the foundational myth of the supposed war between science and faith. But the real story is never that simple, and it begins not with conflict, but with friendship. For years, one of Galileo's greatest admirers and protectors within the church was a man of culture and intelligence, a Florentine named Cardinal Maffeo Barberini. Barberini was fascinated by Galileo's work. They wrote poetry to each other. When Galileo first came under suspicion in 1616, it was Barberini who helped ensure he received only a private warning, not a public condemnation. Then, in 1623, something happened that should have been Galileo's ultimate triumph. His friend Cardinal Barberini was elected Pope. He became Pope Urban VIII. Galileo had a direct line to the most powerful man in Christendom. He believed he now had the protection he needed to publish his life's work, a book that would argue for the Copernican, sun-centered model of the universe. The Pope even gave him his blessing, with one crucial condition, that he treat the Copernican view as a hypothesis, not as proven fact, and that he give the traditional church-supported view a fair hearing. Galileo agreed, and in 1632 he published his masterpiece, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In the book, three characters debate the structure of the cosmos. The arguments for Galileo's own view are placed in the mouth of a brilliant, sharp-witted character. The arguments for the Church's traditional view, the very arguments suggested by his friend the Pope, were placed in the mouth of a character named Simplicio, the simpleton. It's hard to overstate the catastrophic nature of this decision. This wasn't just an intellectual disagreement, this was a public humiliation. Galileo had taken the words of his patron, his friend the Pope, and put them into the mouth of a fool for all of Europe to laugh at. According to reports, Urban VIII was consumed by a cold fury. He felt personally betrayed and publicly mocked. The trial of Galileo that followed was not just about theology, it was about power, politics, and the wounded pride of a slighted monarch. And even then, the outcome was not the simple martyrdom of the myth. Galileo was not burned at the stake. He was not tortured. He was convicted of being, quote, 11, a lesser charge, and sentenced to house arrest, which he served in his own comfortable villa. And the verdict wasn't even unanimous. Of the 10 cardinals who judged him, 3 refused to sign. The story of Galileo is a tragedy, but it's a profoundly human one. It's the story of a brilliant but arrogant man who misjudged the politics of his time and fatally insulted his most powerful protector. And it's the story of an institution that responded to a challenge not just with intellectual debate, but with the brute force of its authority. It was a failure of diplomacy, a failure of friendship, and a failure of humility on all sides. It wasn't a simple war of science versus faith, it was a messy political divorce. So where does this leave our investigation? We began with a simple, powerful premise, that 1,000 years of human history were deliberately obscured, erased by a single institution in the greatest cover-up ever conceived. We followed the evidence, we tested the most spectacular claims. The idea of 3 phantom centuries, inserted into the calendar, dissolved when we checked the math. It was disproven by the uninterrupted testimony of tree rings, and by the records of a battle fought between 2 great empires in the year 751. The map of an ice-free Antarctica turned out to be a brilliant but misread map of South America. The secrets of the Vatican archives, when we looked closer, were not of lost technologies but of human politics, bureaucracy and moral compromise, and the great martyrs of science, Bruno and Galileo, were victims not of a simple war on knowledge, but of a far more complex and personal collision of theology, magic, politics, and ego. At every turn, the grand, monolithic conspiracy seems to fracture into something more complicated, more human. It feels like we've been investigating a crime, only to find that the murder weapon was never fired, the vault was never emptied, and the suspect had a verifiable alibi. And this is the critical turning point. Because if the crime didn't happen as described, then what is the real mystery we've been pursuing? Have we been investigating a historical cover-up, or have we been investigating the story of a cover-up? What if the most successful act of historical manipulation wasn't the erasure of the Middle Ages? What if it was the invention of the Dark Ages in the first place? An idea, crafted and polished over centuries, so powerful it convinced us that 1,000 years of our own past were a barren wasteland of ignorance and superstition. An idea that did its work so well, we never thought to question who wrote it. This changes everything. Our investigation is not over, it's just beginning. But our list of suspects has changed. We're no longer looking at medieval monks in cold scriptoriums. We're now looking at Renaissance poets, Protestant reformers, Enlightenment philosophers, and 19th century historians. Because to solve this new mystery, we have to go back to the beginning, not to the fall of Rome, but to the moment, nearly 1,000 years later, when one man looked back at the centuries behind him and decided to give them a name. It didn't start as history, it started as an insult. So, if the Dark Ages weren't a grand conspiracy, then what were they? Why does this idea have such a powerful hold on our imagination? This is where our investigation pivots. We are no longer searching for a hidden history, we are now searching for the origin of a story so powerful it has reshaped our understanding of the past for 700 years. To find its source, we must ask a simple question. Who was the first person to ever use the phrase Dark Age? The answer is not a king, a pope, or a general. It is not found in a secret archive or a lost chronicle. The idea was born in the mind of a poet, an Italian scholar named Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, writing in the 1330s. And what he meant by darkness had nothing to do with plagues or ignorance or technological collapse. Petrarch was complaining about the quality of Latin. Put simply, he was a literary snob. He believed the Latin of ancient Rome, the language of Cicero and Virgil, was elegant, pure and luminous, and he felt the Latin of his own time was barbaric, clumsy, and corrupted by centuries of misuse. For him, the age he lived in was a saeculum obscurum, a dark age, because the light of good literature had been extinguished. It was a purely aesthetic judgment, a poet's metaphor for the loss of beautiful prose. But a powerful metaphor rarely stays in a poem. Petrarch and the scholars who followed him, the humanists, had a project. They wanted to define their own era as something new, something brilliant. They called it a rinascita, a renaissance, a rebirth. And this is the crucial point. To have a rebirth, you first need a death. To position themselves as the bringers of a new dawn, they needed to create a long, dark night that came before. The period between the fall of Rome and their own time became that night. It was no longer just an era of, quote, 14, it was reframed as a, quote, 15 age. A long, empty and unproductive valley between two cultural peaks, the glory of classical antiquity and the new glory of their own time. The Dark Ages, in other words, were not discovered. They were invented. It was perhaps the most successful branding campaign in history, created not to describe the past, but to sell the present. So the idea began as a literary complaint, a lament for lost eloquence. But a metaphor in the hands of poets is one thing. In the hands of theologians and revolutionaries, it can become a weapon. A poet's turn of phrase is a delicate thing. It captures a feeling, but it doesn't start a war. For that, you need to turn the metaphor into a weapon. You need an enemy, an ideology, and a printing press. And in the 16th century, Petrarch's quiet lament for lost Latin elegance found all three. Europe was being torn apart by the Protestant Reformation, and both sides in this conflict understood a fundamental truth. The battle for the future had to be fought over the memory of the past. To legitimize their break from Rome, Protestant reformers needed to prove that the Catholic Church was not the timeless guardian of faith, but a historical corruption of it. They needed to show that the institution had presided over a long, dark night of superstition and decay. They needed to write an indictment, and so they did. Between 1559 and 1574, a group of scholars in the German city of Magdeburg undertook one of the most ambitious historical projects ever conceived, the Magdeburg Centuries. It was a 13-volume history of the Church, one volume for each century, but it wasn't a neutral history, it was a prosecution. Its goal was to systematically document the perceived corruption of the papacy, century by century, to argue that the Pope was, in fact, the Antichrist. The quote 16 were no longer a vague feeling of loss. They were now Exhibit A in a theological trial, a 1,000-year crime scene presented as historical fact, Petrarch's poetic metaphor had been forged into a theological hammer. A century and a half later, the intellectual battleground shifted again. The enemy was no longer a specific church, but for some, the very idea of faith itself. For the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, the story of the Dark Ages was a perfect instrument. They took the narrative crafted by the Protestants and simply changed the name of the villain. The problem was no longer the Catholic Church. The problem was any church. The enemy was organised religion itself, seen as a force of superstition holding back the progress of human reason. The French philosopher Voltaire famously wished to crush the infamous thing, and the Dark Ages were his prime evidence for its crimes. And then there was Edward Gibbon. In his monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he didn't just document the end of antiquity. He gave the myth its most enduring and elegant expression, famously describing the entire history of the medieval world as __quote _18 ___. The story was the same. A great civilization falls into darkness. But the cause was no longer papal politics. It was the fundamental incompatibility of faith and rational thought. So, do you see the pattern? A story born from a poet's nostalgia was weaponized by theologians to fight a religious war. Then it was repurposed by philosophers to fight a secular one. The shape of the myth remained, but its ideological function evolved. It was a story too useful to discard. By the end of the 18th century, the myth was fully formed. It had become a powerful, elegant narrative about the inevitable triumph of reason over superstition. All that was left was to teach it to everyone. And for that you need two things: schools and eventually movie theatres. If the Enlightenment turned the Dark Ages into a philosophical idea, the 19th century turned it into an industrial product. This was an age that worshipped at the altar of progress, an age of steam engines, telegraphs and empires that believed it was the pinnacle of human history. And every story of progress needs a dark, primitive beginning to measure itself against. The messy, complicated and often innovative Middle Ages were flattened, simplified and repackaged for mass consumption. The new engine for this was the public school system. For the first time, a standardized version of history could be taught to millions, and in those textbooks the Dark Ages became a simple moral lesson, a time of superstition and ignorance that humanity had to overcome to arrive at the glorious scientific present. The story needed villains, and it created them. It needed symbols of backwardness, and it invented them. Take one of the most persistent myths of all, that people in the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. Medieval scholars, from Bede the Venerable in the 8th century onwards, knew perfectly well that the earth was a sphere. The myth of a flat earth consensus was largely invented in 1828 by the American writer Washington Irving. In his wildly popular and mostly fictional biography of Christopher Columbus, Irving crafted a dramatic scene of Columbus, a lone man of science, arguing with ignorant dogmatic churchmen who insisted the world was flat. The story was too good not to be true, and so, a piece of historical fiction became a historical fact, printed in textbooks for over a century. This was just one part of a larger project of invention. The 19th century also gave us the myth of the droit du seigneur, the supposed right of a lord to spend the first night with his subject's bride. It almost certainly never existed as a legal right. It was a literary joke that later generations took seriously. It gave us the chastity belt, a device for which there is virtually no medieval evidence. Most surviving examples are 19th century forgeries. These weren't historical realities. They were projections, fantasies of a brutal, unenlightened past created to make the present feel more civilized, more secure. And then came the final, most powerful layer of the myth. The 20th century didn't need to invent new stories. It just needed to give the old ones a visual form. Hollywood took the caricatures from 19th century novels and textbooks and burned them into our collective memory. It created the visual language of the Dark Ages, the perpetual grey sky, the peasants caked in mud, the gloomy windowless castles, the witch hunts in every village. It's a powerful aesthetic. It's also a complete fabrication. It erases the soaring, light-filled architecture of the Gothic cathedrals. It erases the agricultural revolution that transformed the landscape, and it erases the birth of the university system, one of the medieval period's most enduring gifts to the world. So the story of the Dark Ages isn't a hidden history, it's a manufactured one, built over 700 years, from a poet's metaphor to a philosopher's weapon, to a schoolbook lesson, to a blockbuster movie. And this brings us to our final question. Why do we want to believe in these grand hidden narratives? What does the search for a conspiracy tell us about ourselves? And so, we arrive at the most difficult question in this entire investigation. If the grand conspiracies, the phantom centuries, the ice-free Antarctica, the secret anti-gravity blueprints, if they all dissolve under scrutiny, then why do we need them? Why does the story of a deliberate 1,000-year cover-up feel so much more compelling, so much more real, than the messy, chaotic, and often random story of actual history? To answer this, we have to leave the archives and enter a different kind of territory, the architecture of the human mind itself. And perhaps no one has mapped this territory better than the Italian writer Umberto Eco. Eco was not just a novelist. He was a professor of semiotics, the study of signs and symbols, and crucially, a world-class medieval historian. He understood the medieval mind, and he understood the modern mind's obsession with finding secrets within it. In 1988, he published a novel that acts as a perfect laboratory for our question. It's called Foucault's Pendulum. In it, 3 bored editors at a publishing house decide to amuse themselves by inventing the ultimate conspiracy theory. They take every secret society, every occult manuscript, every historical anomaly they can find, the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the Assassins, and weave them all into a single, magnificent Quote 19 that has secretly guided all of world history. It begins as a game, but then something strange happens. People start to believe it. The fake plan begins to generate real-world consequences, and the game becomes deadly. Eco's novel is a warning. It shows that the human mind is a pattern-matching machine of terrifying power. We are biologically wired to connect the dots, to find signals in the noise. It's how our ancestors survived. But this strength is also a vulnerability. Our mind abhors a vacuum of meaning. When faced with the silence of the archives, with lost records, with the sheer random brutality of history, we find the idea of chaos unbearable. It feels more comforting to believe in a hidden evil plan than to believe in no plan at all. This is where we get to the philosophical core of the issue. The philosopher Karl Popper offered a powerful diagnosis for this impulse. He called the conspiracy theory of society a consequence of, quote, 20, quote, it comes, he wrote, from asking the question, quote, 21, quote. When a society no longer sees a divine hand guiding history, it doesn't stop looking for a plan. It simply starts looking for a human one, a secret committee, a shadowy cabal, an all-powerful institution pulling the strings, and in this search for a hidden hand, what better candidate could there be than the Vatican? Ancient, secretive, wealthy, and speaking in a dead language, an institution that has watched empires rise and fall, that measures its own life in centuries. It is the perfect screen onto which we can project our deep-seated need for an answer to Popper's question. It fills the void. It provides the hidden agent, the secret plan that makes the chaos of history feel manageable. But this reveals what true institutional power is. It's rarely about having a perfect secret blueprint for history. It's something more subtle and far more real. This brings us to the heart of our investigation, to the final and most important question. If the mind is a machine that builds stories to make sense of the world, then what is the role of a great ancient institution? Is it to tell one single, definitive story? We began with the idea of power as a crude act of deletion, burning books, hiding maps, erasing centuries from the calendar. This is the model of power found in a thriller. It's dramatic, simple, and satisfying, but it's also inefficient. A fact is a stubborn thing. You can burn a library, but a single copy might survive in a dusty corner of the world. You can kill a person, but their ideas might have already spread. Total erasure is almost impossible. There is a more subtle and far more effective form of power. It's not about controlling the facts. It's about controlling what the facts mean. It's the power of interpretation. Let's go back to the story of Aristotle. When his works reappeared in Europe, a tidal wave of brilliant, disruptive, and often pagan ideas threatened to overwhelm 1,000 years of theology. The Church could have declared total war, attempting to hunt down and burn every last copy of his writings. This would have been a bloody and likely losing battle. Instead, it did something much smarter. It couldn't unwrite Aristotle, so it did the next best thing. It rewrote how to read Aristotle. Through the monumental work of Thomas Aquinas, the dangerous Greek philosopher was carefully filtered, reinterpreted, and woven into the very fabric of Christian doctrine. The sharp edges were smoothed, the contradictions explained away. The threat wasn't eliminated, it was assimilated, and once the Thomistic interpretation was established, it became the official lens, it became the canon. You could still read Aristotle, but if you read him differently, you weren't just wrong, you were now a heretic. This is the true nature of epistemic power. It's not the brute force of the censor, but the quiet, persistent work of the librarian, the theologian, the archivist. The power of the Vatican archive is not just in the 85 kilometers of shelves, it's in the catalogue, the index, the system of organisation that determines which documents are filed next to each other, which subjects are considered important, and which are relegated to a footnote. The power lies in creating the pathways that guide the researcher, making one line of inquiry seem logical and another impossible. It's the power to define the frame, and in doing so, to control the picture. This is a more mature model of how power over knowledge actually works. It isn't a conspiracy, it's a system that doesn't need to hide the evidence when it can control the conclusion. So we are left with a world of complex interpretations, of human motives and institutional inertia. It can feel unstable. In a world where human records can be misinterpreted, weaponized, or simply lost, is there anything we can truly hold on to? Is there any clock that cannot be faked? After this entire journey through myths, forgeries, and the quiet politics of memory, it's easy to feel adrift. If our histories are just stories, and those stories can be rewritten, what can we actually hold on to? What ground is solid? If the human archive, the library, the chronicle, the papal bull, is a place of interpretation and power, then our investigation requires a final witness, one that exists outside this entire system. We need an archive that has no scribe, no agenda, and no theology. An archive that cannot lie, because it has no concept of truth. It only records sequence, and we have already met two of its keepers. The first is the forest. Remember the German oak trees from Hohenheim. For more than 12,000 years they have been keeping a perfect, unbroken chronicle. Each year, a new ring. A wet year is a wide ring, a dry year is a narrow one. It's a simple, physical record of time passing. This archive cannot be edited. You cannot persuade a tree to forget a year, or to insert a few phantom centuries for political convenience. To fake this record, you wouldn't just need to rewrite a few books. You would need to travel back in time and physically re-engineer every forest in Europe. The second keeper is the night sky, the clockwork of the cosmos. When Chinese astronomers in the Tang dynasty recorded a solar eclipse in the year 761, they were documenting an event governed by physics, an event we can retroactively calculate with near-perfect precision, and our calculations confirm it. The eclipse happened exactly when they said it did. The same is true for the observations of the Arab astronomer al-Battani in Syria, right in the middle of the so-called phantom years. For this to be a forgery, the conspiracy would not only have to unite the Vatican, the Caliphate in Baghdad, and the Emperor in Chang'an, it would have to be powerful enough to physically alter the orbits of the Earth and the Moon. This is the intellectual ground we were searching for. These are the clocks that cannot be faked. Human institutions can control the story of time. They can name the years, define the eras, and decide which events are worth remembering. But they cannot control time itself. The physical world keeps its own memory. It is a memory written in the language of growth rings, radioactive decay, and celestial mechanics. And this provides a profound sense of stability. It tells us that while our human reality is a construct of stories, it is painted on a canvas of physical reality that is robust and unchangeable. The trees and the stars don't tell us what happened in a given year. They don't tell us about the rise and fall of kings, the birth of ideas, or the quiet desperation of a peasant. But they tell us with absolute certainty that the year happened. They give us the timeline. They provide the grid. The story painted on that grid, that is the work of history. And investigating that story with all its power, paradox, and myth-making is our real and unending task. We began this investigation with a simple cinematic question. Was the greatest cover-up in history the deliberate erasure of time itself? We stood at a 1,000-year crime scene looking for a culprit. We were promised a story of a powerful institution hiding forbidden knowledge, manipulating timelines, and holding the true history of humanity under lock and key. And in a way, we found one, just not the one we were looking for. The story we uncovered was not about a secret cabal rewriting the calendar. It was about how we, as humans, write history. The real cover-up wasn't a malicious act of deletion performed in a secret vault. It was a slow, 700-year-long act of storytelling, carried out in the open. It was a poet's metaphor, later sharpened into a weapon by Protestant reformers, then polished into a philosophical tool by the Enlightenment, and finally mass-produced as a cliché by Hollywood. The Dark Ages myth isn't a lie that was forced upon us. It's a story we collectively told ourselves because it was useful. It helped the Renaissance feel more brilliant, the Reformation more righteous, and the Age of Progress more advanced. It gave us a simple narrative of darkness and light, and we are creatures who crave simple narratives. The true power of an institution like the medieval church wasn't in its ability to burn every last book. As we saw, its real power was far more subtle and far more durable. It was the power to control interpretation, the power not to erase Aristotle, but to decide how he would be read, the power not to hide the past, but to become the official narrator of its meaning. This is a more complex, more adult form of power than simply hiding a map in a basement. In the end, this investigation leads us to a strange conclusion. The world is not less mysterious because grand conspiracies dissolve under scrutiny. It is more mysterious. A world where a lone monk in a cold scriptorium preserves an atheist's poem for 1,000 years is more beautifully complex than one where he simply burns it. A world where a scientific revolution is sparked by the personal ego of a slighted pope is more deeply human than one where it's a simple battle of good versus evil. The real adventure is not in finding the single hidden key that unlocks all of history. It is in learning to see the machinery of the lock itself, to understand that the past is not a static object to be discovered, but an ongoing argument to be understood. The ultimate lesson is not to distrust everything, it is to investigate everything, with patience, with curiosity, and with an acceptance that the most profound truths are rarely simple. If this journey through the layers of a story, taking it apart not to destroy it, but to understand how it was built, is something you find valuable, consider subscribing to join the investigation. And a final question for the comments. What historical truth have you always found suspicious? What story deserves a closer look?